Before we go any further, I'd like to formally introduce Daniel Natusch, and I'll start off by saying in 2011, our guest co-authored and published a paper titled "Wildlife Laundering Through Breeding Farms, Illegal Harvest, Population Declines, and a Means of Regulating the Trade of Green Tree Pythons." This paper revealed what many condor keepers in the U.S. had believed to be true, and that is the vast number of condors entering the United States under the farm-bred moniker were indeed wild-caught animals. In 2012, he co-authored another paper titled "Relationships Between Ontogenic Changes in Prey Selection, Head Shape, Sexual Maturity, and Color in an Australasian Python," which was Morelia viridis, green tree python. And this paper revealed that young condors preferred ground-based ectothermic prey and adults preferred semi-arboreal endothermic prey, amongst other astute observations of these arboreal predators. And then finally, in the summer of 2013, Daniel visited the States and presented at the International Collective Arboreal Symposium, which we call ICAS, and his presentation was very well received and has left many folks wanting more and asking many more questions.
Why don't you give us just a minute or two of background on yourself, what you think that the listener should know about you?
I guess I should start with, I suppose, a similar story to everybody, that I grew up with a fascination with nature and animals, plants, and those sort of things, and was spending a lot of time in northern Australia and specifically Cape York Peninsula in areas and habitats where green pythons occur. For me in those days, I used to happen across them and they were just that green snake that curls up. I didn't really think much of it. And I suppose I was about 14 when I found my first green python, and growing up I began to have a more academic interest in what they were doing, and I began to understand about their desirability in pet trade and so on. And I started a master's degree looking at their abundance, population sizes, and those sort of things in the Australian population, specifically in the Mako-Wraith and Island ranges. And then after that, shortly after that, I started venturing into New Guinea, where we happened across the trade in large numbers of chondros for the pet trade. It turned out that they were being exported as captive bred when in fact they were being collected from the wild. And I'm still researching chondros, not quite as much as I was in the past, and these days mainly the efforts are focused on enforcement activities, but doing a lot of research with other species such as scrub pythons and carpets and blackheads and those sort of things here where I live in Cape York. And that's about it for me.
Yeah.
So, Daniel, why research with condors other than your interest? Was it just something you said, why were you drawn to doing research with condors, and specifically, was it just your general interest that you acquired growing up in the Cape York area? Or, did someone say, hey, maybe this would be a good research project for you as you work on your master's degree?
No, so actually, it's a bit of a convoluted story. I guess chondros, because I was spending a lot of time in areas where not a lot of people go, which is because they're very remote and difficult to access, and the challenges you face when you're there out in the field are challenges that many people are not interested in facing. And so I guess it's from that I understood that in Australia they were of restricted distribution, and so I thought, I might as well. But there is something about chondros compared to other snakes, something very, very special. I can't pinpoint it, but obviously that from an evolutionary point of view, colour is the most conspicuous thing about an animal that we can see visually. And so these individuals being born red or yellow and then changing colour to green so dramatically, that is a really fascinating aspect of their natural history. And I think answering questions to do with natural selection and Darwinian evolution, they're a fantastic model organism for doing that. And so that's sort of from the academic interest. I guess I started my master's in the first year of my undergraduate degree, which is not typically how most people start their master's degrees. But I basically found a supervisor who was willing to take me on, and really in the early days did the research sort of as an excuse to play with cool snakes in cool places. And then,
right, okay.
then the interest did develop, and eventually I submitted a thesis and was awarded a master's. And since that time, the academic interest has just grown and stimulated and carried on. And now I've moved into New Guinea and started studying the other populations, and always been interested in the sort of the social side of it and how they were traded and so on, and looked into economics of rarity and a few other different issues that chondros are just a good species for answering those sort of questions.
Gotcha. Understandable. Now, when you wrote the wildlife laundering through the breeding farms paper that you co-authored and published in 2011, was that part of your master's work, or was this something you were doing outside of that work?
No, so the first publication was on green pythons in Cape York Peninsula, where in one of the populations that it's really the only accessible population there in Iron Range, and specifically along a creek line in the Claudie catchment around Gordon's Creek, where I think is probably the easiest place in the world to find and see crows in their natural habitat. And because of that access and because of the interest, I think when I first started studying green pythons, they sold for $20,000 a pop in Australia.
Wow.
And so there was a lot of interest, obviously, and quite a few people, more than most people realize, quite a few people went up and took them from the specific area, which was accessible and they were relatively easy to find. And we found, in comparison to other populations, there'd been a shift in the size and the population demographic in that area. And it's hard to be 100% sure whether that's attributable to poaching, for want of a better word, or collection or harvesting. But it was certainly interesting. And so Jessica Lyons actually did her master's degree on the trade of green pythons in New Guinea. We were sort of tossing up different ideas. Should we do some radio telemetry studies or so on? And just said no, she'd rather look at the sort of social aspects and things based on earlier work I had done in New Guinea, where I sort of came back and said, hey, look, there's a thriving trade and there might be a master's degree in this, and certainly a good opportunity to travel around a beautiful part of the world and get some cool science done. And so Jess and I embarked on that, and I suppose the rest is history.
Right. Now, when you were doing your research for the paper you published in 2011, the wildlife laundering, did you have some idea before you began the research that this was as widespread as it is, or were you surprised by the result?
I owned and I'd read Greg Maxwell's book, which I haven't read for a long time, but from memory, doesn't he hint upon it in the book? I think he hints upon the fact that some of these farms may have been doing this. I can't remember exactly, but there was a general underlying feeling that some of this was going on, like you alluded to at the start of the show. There was just no hard evidence that it was actually occurring. And so in 2009, just for shits and giggles, I went with a mate to Biak Island, and Biak is where the largest number of chondros are being taken from the wild, and we really, we hit upon a very large trade where up to 200 individuals were being taken out of the forest every week. And so it's just a large volume of snakes, and so we thought, well, this is particularly impacting on these populations, and therefore is worthy of further study. Other areas in New Guinea are not harvested quite nearly as much as that Biak population, but I don't think it's necessarily surprising, given that there are people there who struggle to make a living doing other things often, and so a snake can be quite a bit of income for them, and so it's hard hard to wrong them for that.
Right,
Daniel,
absolutely.
Daniel, it sounds like in your travels and your experience, you've come across some of the farms in Indonesia. I mean, can you tell the listeners some of your personal experiences with? I know there's several government accredited farms in Indonesia, and there's probably others that are not accredited by the Indonesian government. Can you expand a little bit about just some personal experiences you've had with farm-bred animals there?
Yeah, sure. I suppose a disclaimer to begin. My research with several farms was in 2010 and 11. I've been back subsequently to a small number of farms, but the point is that some of the data or information may have changed since then. So I'm not going to name any farms specifically, but in Indonesia there are 19 registered companies that are allowed to, government registered companies that are allowed to export reptiles. A smaller number of those, I can't remember how many, a smaller number are registered to breed green pythons. So I think in 1990 green pythons were fully protected in Indonesia, and that means they're not allowed to be taken from the wild. However, breeding farms were set up, and green pythons, as you know, can be exported as captive bred with CITES permits with a source code C, which stands for captive bred. When I was doing my research, there were no farms, not a single one, that did not take wild caught animals and export them as captive bred. That situation, as I say, may have changed now. I just don't know.
Sure.
Okay.
There are certain farms that are literally just a front for laundering animals. They don't have any facilities or stocks and those sort of things, and they just bring in wild caught animals from collectors and ship them straight off. There are others that breed very, very small numbers. They may get the choicest specimen, say a high blue animal from Biak or something or other, and attempt to breed it, and they have some success, as I understand. And then there are other farms that breed larger numbers of chondros, genuinely captive bred chondros of several generations. But those farms, when I was doing a lot of research in the country, they were still exporting large numbers of illegally wild caught animals.
So basically, it was a crapshoot. You wouldn't know when animals came over if they were truly farm-bred, captive-bred animals, or if they were animals taken from the wild.
Technically, no. I mean, I've seen a hell of a lot of these things, and so I can generally tell whether they're wild caught or captive bred. Just looking at them, I wouldn't go to so far as to say I'm right 100% of the time, but you know, when you've seen so many, it's relatively easy, as I'm sure it is for you guys also. The difficulty is when they're juveniles, and in particular, Biak Island individuals, large numbers of Biak Island animals are brought in as juveniles, and some farms will keep them for a while, feed them a couple of pinky mice and worm them before sending them out.
Scary.
Which hopefully we'll get on to later. I won't talk too much about it now, but that's not necessarily a problem. You know, sure, it's illegal, and a lot of people have a moral issue with it, but in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with that. The only difficulty is that they're being falsely advertised, and so hopefully we can discuss it a bit later in the show. But fundamentally, there's not too much of an issue with that. It's just the misinformation.